the number of the month is sort of, you know, in those Sunday supplement type of articles. Well, what if during the near-death experience, you know, the entire neuronal grid, as it were, was lit up? What would our experience be if all of our neurons were sort of functioning and firing at this particular time? Would we not have, for perhaps that particular instant, a kind of universal knowledge? That seems to be what people phenomenologically are reporting during this experience. We need to do the kinds of scientific studies that talk about changes in brain function, perhaps, to be able to begin to understand what may actually mediate these tremendous experiences that people are reliably reporting during these near-death encounters.
But as a scientist, Ken, how can you operationally define a term like universal knowledge?
Well, I think all that we can do is simply give the reports that people give us of their experiences. They say this repeatedly, that they had omniscience, or they had a kind of universal knowledge pour into them. Many mystics have said exactly the same thing when they have their experiences. In my view, the near-death experience is a kind of mystical experience. And so even though we can't operationalize these kinds of experiences, or say, here are the operations that we can do to induce this particular experience, what we can do, at least at this point in our research, is collate all of these accounts and see their commonalities, not only among near-death experiences, but with other allied experiences, such as mystical or religious or experience of cosmic consciousness. All of these experiences seem to be, if not brothers, then at least cousins in the same family. And the kinds of explanations that are offered for one would presumably suffice to be able to explain the others.
Now, in the Yoga Sutras, for example, and many other texts for spiritual discipline, spiritual awakening, it is said that when one engages in a particular practice, certain experiences occur, and also certain powers, gifts of the spirit, powers of the mind occur. And I gather that you've documented these as well.
Yes, in fact, I make exactly that same point in my book, Heading Toward Omega. I talk about the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali and say that as a consequence, or as a byproduct of spiritual development, certain psychic powers or other kinds of gifts begin to unfold quite naturally. That's what seemed to happen in near-death experiences. And there have now been probably at least a half dozen, maybe 10, somewhere in that vicinity, studies of the development of people following near-death experiences, and a very high proportion of these people, as I was saying earlier, do develop very definite psychic gifts that they say either they did not have before these experiences, or they had to a very small degree, and something about the near-death experience seems to have actuated them and brought them in from a more or less latent state into a state of realization. That is one of the very common after effects of near-death experiences. And again, we only have the reports that people give, but the reports are so common, Jeffrey. If you took 100 people that had near-death experiences, probably at least half of them, if not more, would say that their psychic awareness decidedly increased, markedly increased after their own NDEs. It's almost as if there is an opening. There is an opening of a kind of channel, and when that channel begins to open, then these kinds of experiences can flow through. People become more intuitive, they become more psychic, they have a higher level of awareness. Some of them may channel, and this it's as if once the dam bursts, a lot of material of higher consciousness begins to flow through.
Healing, for example, is something that you write about, and there I would think we can get medical corroboration.
Yeah, at least potentially. There actually have not yet been performed really good scientific studies of people that have NDEs, but we do again have self-report data. For example, there was one study in Australia that said something like about 8% of the people that had near-death experiences, before their experience, had some healing gifts, and after that, something like 2/3 of those people reported healing gifts. And healing abilities, again, a gift of the spirit, to put it in that kind of language. Healing gifts are one of the very commonly reported after effects from near-death experiences, and they do deserve to be better studied by scientists. In fact, I would have to say, in all candor, that one of the weakest aspects of the field of near-death studies is that we do not have the degree of scientific corroboration for many of the claims that have been made by near-death experiencers. But these claims, again, are so pandemic that they have to be acknowledged and addressed, and I think people who are interested in subtle energies and other forms of modern science that would connect with a near-death experience, a lot of these people will certainly begin to do these kinds kinds of studies, and I think if they do, will corroborate many of the claims that we have now only on the basis of self-reports.
Well, there certainly is a whole new line of research opening up in distant healing. And
Yes.
there ought to be some opportunities there, I suppose, as this whole area of transpersonal psychology and distant healing and parapsychology opens up and becomes, shall we say, unified with the field of near-death research. One would expect more and more kinds of synergistic research to occur.
Well, I certainly hope that in many of the talks that I've given, I've tried to encourage people from all of these disciplines to take a look at the near-death phenomenon and begin to research it in laboratories and in other objective settings so that we can really extend this field beyond the level of self-report where it mostly exists now.
Ken, we're about to take a break.
I'll be prepared.
We'll be right back. Welcome back to Thinking Aloud. I'm your host, Jeffrey Mishlove. My guest is Professor Kenneth Ring, one of the leading authorities in the world on the phenomenon of the near-death experience. He is author of Lessons from the Light and a half a dozen other books. Ken, it strikes me that the most significant aspect of the near-death phenomenon overall is that it lends an enormous amount of credence to a world view which is very different from our conventional materialistic scientific way of seeing the world, and very similar to what Aldous Huxley referred to as the perennial philosophy, or Houston Smith calls the primordial tradition, the kind of basic assumptions that underlie the religions of the world.
I think it does connect with that, and one of the things that has struck me in my research on this phenomenon, and I think it's also true for other people who've looked into it, is that people who have this experience, almost regardless of their initial point of view, if they were religious or if they were not religious, if they were spiritual or not spiritual, if they were atheistic or not, they come to have almost a similar point of view along the lines of the perennial philosophy. They describe themselves as much more spiritual people, not necessarily more religious, and they make such statements as, I feel as if I would be at home in any church, or all religions have truth. There are a lot of pronouncements that if people were made by near-death experiencers, which if they were familiar with the idea of a perennial philosophy, they would have no difficulty in endorsing. I think this is a very beautiful aspect of the experience, too, because it suggests that once you have this kind of awakening, whether through a near-death experience or in some other way, then you come to a point not only of this kind of realization, but you have a sense of tolerance and appreciation for the diversity of religious or spiritual worldviews, but you see it within this sort of overarching framework of the perennial philosophy or the universality of a spiritual framework.
You've even documented, as I recall, cases of people who were adamantly atheistic,
Yes.
who then have the near-death experience. And how do they integrate it?
Well, the people that I've talked with who have described themselves as skeptics, as agnostics, or as atheists often have difficulty using religious terms afterward, but they know what they've experienced, and the term, which is almost a code word in a certain sense, for this is the light. They don't have any difficulty talking about the light, but they might have difficulty talking about God or more obviously religious terms. But if you look at the way they describe the experience, and if you look at the kinds of changes they report in their life, and their opening to spiritual worldviews, you can see that their previous skepticism or agnosticism or even atheism has been eroded to such an extent that it virtually dissolves, and they become very spiritually oriented people too.
And when we talk about the light, my impression is that we're describing an intelligence. It's
Yes.
not just some sort of visual
Yes,
sensation.
absolutely.
It's as if one is there in the presence of a great, comforting, wise intelligence. Spiritual guides, for example,